closest to vertical with fewest obstacles. Yeah, one each. Some people may already have them. You're going to, but you have it right now. Okay.
Is this the night chronometer?
You'll have to look at. You'll have to look in the first in the.
It says
the
karma concept, but I don't recognize what that means.
you don't recognize what?
I just know I was given the code for the night chronometer, but I don't recognize him by the name karma concept.
Karma Kamsang. We can go into that. We can go into
Okay.
Let's. Wangchuk Dorje. Wangchuk Dorje. First, we'll do a little exercise that's familiar to you who have been part of the Mahamudra program. We're under Boka Rinpoche. And for those for whom it is new, it's a fairly simple exercise. It's called clearing the stale air. 3 rounds of clearing the stale air. Longro Sum. And it's quite simple. Begin with your hands, with your thumb under the base of the ring finger. With your hands loosely on your thighs. And then there's a series of motions associated with the breath where you extend your hands and your fingers out on the exhale and then draw them back in on the inhalation. And breath that goes with it is it's kind of a medium breath, starting a little slowly and then being a little bit more full on the exhale. Sometimes it's called the wheat breath because it begins kind of narrow and sort of a rice grain breath. It's kind of gentle at the beginning and at the very end as it tapers off. And with this, we begin first imagining on the exhalation. What we imagine on each of the 3 breaths is the same. There's a little change in reference. each one. But on each breath, as we exhale, we feel and imagine clouds of smoke and dark light exiting through all our pores. And on the inhalation, like millions of tiny rainbows entering our body. And with the first exhalation and inhalation, we imagine that all the kleshas and obscurations of the mind of the past are dispelled. On the second, we imagine all the obscuration, and on the inhalation, all the blessings of all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas enter us. And then on the second, it's the kleshas and obscurations of the present. And on the third, the kleshas and obscurations of the future. So we're exhaling the stale winds that are associated with that. It's a nice place to begin. So at your own pace, then we'll begin with refuge and bodhicitta on the first page. In English. In the Buddha, Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until enlightenment. Through the merit of generosity and other perfections, may I accomplish Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. In the Buddha, Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until enlightenment. Through the merit of generosity and the other perfections, may I accomplish Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. In the Buddha, Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until enlightenment. Through the merit of generosity and the other perfections, may I accomplish Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. So we'll sit for just a minute or so. Don't take long to settle your mind. Just let it settle, because it really will be just a minute. and mentally dedicate the benefit, holding all beings of the past, present, and future, including yourself. So good morning and welcome. This is the beginning of a series of efforts that are designed primarily, in my mind, to make sure that those who are engaged in the Mahamudra program have some support, additional encouragement. But I recognize that there are people who may wish to be part of something like that, or maybe part of it have engaged in many of these practices in other traditions, because the core of practice is really quite similar. So I have a broader wish as well to provide an opportunity for anyone who has an interest in these practices to have an additional place where there's some support for that, some encouragement, a place where all the little peculiar questions that you have based on whatever, whether your experience with these practices is long and deep, or whether it's merely a glancing blow, or just starting out, whatever it is. Over the years, I've come to appreciate the potential of all the core practices associated with any of the ways that that Mahamudra is presented in the Kagyu tradition. I'm not really familiar with others, so I can't claim to be interested in others based on experience, but to the extent that I have come across the same teachings in other traditions, I find many of the same principles involved. So I'm really hoping that this will be an opportunity for us all to go deeper and to find something richer, something more than whatever it is that we started out with. That said, I have some understanding of who you all are and what your interests are, but I don't know completely. Another way to say it is I have encouraged myself to develop all kinds of expectations and projections about you, which probably should be continually corrected, and probably starting right now is not a bad time to start. But I know, at least I'll confess my projections. My projections include that some of you are actively part of Bokar Rinpoche's Mahamudra program. So this is one neat category that I've created in my mind. Others of you have done these practices in other traditions, in other formats, and have some interest that you'll actually have to explain to me, since my projections about that are even more vague, shall we say. And I assume that some people are relatively new as well. I have some vague impression. I'll do my best to introduce everybody as I go through this. I have some impression of Stan and Gail and Cynthia and Willa's background, though not entirely, but mainly exposed to the foundation practices and other elements of the Mahamudra practice in other circumstances elsewhere. Linda, Suvanch, Linda, Tracy, and Solidra. I recognize all of you from the Mahamudra program. So there. And Peter, I know, has some exposure to Wondro in another Kagyu, Karma Kagyu association.
I'm really just working on the preliminaries.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's Wondro. That's part of it. I'm not saying everybody's doing everything. And Bruce, I actually don't know what your background is.
Not much.
Not much.
Yeah, it's my exposure to Mahamudra is basically in some books that I've read in the last year.
Uh-huh. And in terms of the preliminary practices, Wondro, any exposure to that?
Yeah.
Okay.
My my active exposure to Tibetan Buddhism was through Naropa University, contemplative end-of-life care program.
All right. Okay. So I hope that something kind of radiates through the jargon and the insider knowledge or the insider thing along the way. Somebody asked me earlier this week whether or not they might come, and I said, sure. And they said, well, I'm not really doing this, and I'm just kind of interested. I said, that's fine. Even spiritual tourists are welcome. So I have kind of an open place to start with this. But along the way, it will actually depend upon all of you and those who will come and go along the way to be very explicit about what you hope for, what kinds of questions you have. For some of you, you may have started Wondro or some aspects of programs and practices in the Mahamudra package, I'll call it, and come to a halt for one reason or another. And there may be still some lingering enthusiasm or curiosity or a sense of appreciation even. I'm thinking of what you said recently. Some appreciation for the practices. So that's all in my heart. So I am trying to process this in a way that's will be of benefit. Any brief questions or comments or something that's right on the tip of your tongue at the moment? Linda?
Are we going to do the Om breath?
We could. I hadn't planned on that, but that's part of the program. So amongst the question and answers, if there are things that are particular, then we'll go over them. Peter.
Maybe along the lines, when I tend to do the prostrations, I tend to use those syllables, om, hum, like when, I'll say them, om, and hung, and I just was wondering if, I don't know if that's, I'm not sure if the syllables are meant to be said out loud or if they're
We can go into that question in terms of the details of the practice. Anything just along the lines of general outlook or hopes? Yes.
Because it seems like the same one that I've been given the transmission for
Mm-hmm.
through Teargar, and I got maybe a third way through before I paused last October. If I took it up again, it doesn't seem, but then I'm projecting and wondering, is there, might it be confusing to just continue with the method and essentially add your teachings and these questions to what I'm
Hmm.
making a more major shift. Although it might just be a minor shift. I don't know.
That you'll have to find out whether it's a major or a minor shift. I would actually assume that most things that we talk about will be they won't actually require a shift per se. There'll be additional perspectives.
Yeah.
So that's likely. But these are the kinds of, if you get down to the nitty gritty of should I do A or B, then that's actually a very personal conversation. The general principle that I would offer in relationship to that is that it really depends on where your momentum is and how gelled or ungelled that momentum is, and how much you're engaged in the particulars in a certain way. If something's actively working, yeah, don't mess with it.
So thanks for the reassurance of what I was guessing.
Yeah. And you may find that this is either helpful or not helpful, or you don't know for a while. All the possibilities. Any particular hopes that you have, Willa?
My question was similar, and I had the same instinct.
Mm-hmm.
But I do see some differences are larger than others in terms of the liturgy and
Mm-hmm.
visualizations, and since I seem to have more in a groove in a particular direction.
Mm-hmm. I'm very sympathetic to having worn a groove, and I encourage people to take advantage of it. I'm frankly very uninterested in which recitations anybody does. I'm much more interested in something more fundamental than that. And I myself very deeply sympathize with the notion of having worn a groove, because in my efforts to prepare for this, I spent quite some time trying to disabuse myself of the habits to finish all the sentences that I started in English with the translation that I knew previously. It's virtually impossible for me to take my eye off the page and not just go into another groove. So everybody will have to sort of kind of ride a different track in terms of how much detail to absorb, and how to translate detail that's not necessarily fitting exactly the groove that you have, to translate it into some kind of more general principle. Linda.
Do you want me to grab the microphone for the questions?
That could help. Suvansh.
So Bill, I guess I'm here because when we go into the program, the experience.
I guess we won't. All right. I think the volume level on that one is set way high because something happened the last time we were playing with the microphones. So, well, that's simpler in one way. So you're...
We go into the program, at least my experience of it is, right, and then we come out and we have one experience of the practices that we're supposed to do. But in why I'm really enthusiastic about how we've rolled out our continuing support of the Mahamudra seminar is the hope that we will actually do the practices, okay, and that I can therefore go back home and have a sense that this is how we did the practice when we were together, and so I have confidence that I'm doing it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that, I guess, is my request, is we actually go through, you know, the various
Yeah.
pieces of the seminar that were communicated to us.
Mm-hmm.
Because just like as an example, I was reading the Vajrasattva practice this morning from Dilgo Khense's write-up.
Mm.
And at some point in time, I realized, wait a minute, the visualizations and what he's doing are not quite what I had at the seminar.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
I then had to put aside the book and say to myself, okay, you know, I have a sense of what he's saying, but if I'm going to do this practice and do it daily and have a sense of confidence in it, then I need to stick to what
Mm-hmm.
we've been asked to do.
Yes. Yeah. When we read something like the words of the revered Master Dilgo Khense, we do have to be able to find the level of information that we actually can derive from that applies to how we're doing the practice. No matter what way you do the practice, you will be doing the practice one way or another, even if you change things around and do it differently every day. Every time you do it, you will do it one way or another. And so it's very helpful to actually have some constancy in that. Just you have a groove, you've created it. That's the one to pour the energy and understanding into. And so when we read Dilgo Khense's commentary on practice, and it's very similar. And in particular, in Londro, there is so much similarity at certain levels between the different approaches to the practice that you can easily find things that are useful. But if you say, oh, well, in this case, he says to do this on page this, and you don't have a page that, and that's not what it says on your page too, then you have to quickly say, that's not what I'm here for. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not listening for that. I'm not reading for that information. I'm reading for some general guidance and general perspective. But at the beginning, depending on where you are in the practice and which practice you're doing, sometimes it's better not to, it is better to set aside the practice. So this is part of the challenge that I have accepted for myself and for you, is to create some kind of container where we can have these kinds of discussions and separate the principles out where the principles are generally applicable, go into the details where they need to be discussed in order to provide confidence that you actually have a workable method. And for those who aren't following that particular method, be able to find a way to listen to that description in a way that you can translate back to the method that you have. So that's my aspiration, and I will try to have times along the way through the year where we actually do at least a bit of practice together. So there's like, that you have some confidence. This is the way. This is a workable method. It's a workable method.
So you in the past have given us the cliff notes.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess when I hear Sivancha's question and I hear the word, I'd like assurance that I'm doing this,
Mm-hmm.
I think of how beneficial those notes are, and I guess I want to jump in and say, oh, don't worry, you're going to have the cliff notes, so you go home, you know what you're doing.
Yes, I
You have them? All right, good.
I agree.
All right.
Is this something that's already been distributed?
Not today. This was the what we call the Cliff Notes in modern parlance, are the notes that provide on this page at this point, if you want to go through it according to what Bokar Rinpoche suggested, you read this section as a support for the practice, and you read it this many times, then you skip to here, you contemplate this, you move to here, and then at this point you recite this many recitations of a mantra, or you do this many prostrations. It lays it out so there's an outline that you can follow. I'll jump slightly into another topic, but this actually brings it up. If we step onto the path of Mahamudra and we start looking at any practice manual for the path, it can be rather daunting. It seems like a whole lot. It's like Mahamudra, the ocean of definitive meaning, Ninth Karmapa's treatise on all the aspects of the path. I'm aiming all these pages at all of you so that you can absorb this notion that, you know, it could be very daunting to have huge detail. All that detail goes into laying out a progression of practice. It all goes into creating a structure for cultivating the views over time. It all goes into creating the basis for having the motivation to practice. There's a huge richness in this. In that structure, everything in this world that is created to be a help also has some unintended consequences along the way. And so having kind of all the possible support and steps laid out is a help. But this is Bokar Rinpoche's condensed outline, which, depending on your outlook, whether you have a huge appetite for detail or you would rather have, I'm just showing you, just kind of this, just inches of pages, whether you'd rather have like a clearer sense of the outline, that might offer some relief. Well, this one's Opening the Door of Certainty. The door to certainty.
I found the torture certainty very useful.
That's a different piece. That's mainly just on the window practices. But yeah. But that takes just it's about that. The Dungwandro is fewer than that pages in here, but then that turns into this many pages in here. The torture certainty, or the torture to meaning. Yeah. So we could go back to like all of these things, kind of biggest, medium, small. We get down to Tilopa's instructions. Don't go to the past. Don't go to the future. give up sorting out and fiddling with the present. Don't analyze. Don't fabricate. Simply rest. And we have to look to see why it is that doesn't just happen. So we go from that to this, and back and forth and back and forth. And along the way, there are some things that we can point out that are, and they're kind of, there are some reasons why the mind doesn't just rest. There are reasons that it doesn't just simply and naturally recognize its own true nature. We talk about the obscurations, the kleshas. Obscurations, you could say the obscurations to knowledge, that's one way to put it. The obscurations, things that cut us off from true seeing. You could also say that same phrase as the obscurations of knowledge. The obscurations that are created by all the things that we think we know that just ain't so about the true nature of our mind and phenomena. There's huge momentum there. There's a huge momentum in all the patterns that emerge out of this lack of seeing. The patterns of fixation, the patterns of acceptance and rejection, and all the complications of the elaborations of pride, jealousy, avarice, anger, aversion, all the different permutations of the kleshas. The reasons that our minds don't just turn, settle, recognize. We've cultivated we could say, from the Buddhist perspective, countless eons of daily practice in the obscurations and the kleshas, raising it to a highly refined art. And so, since there are reasons, and some of them are kind of complicated on the surface, if we are going to actually address those things, we need to have some kind of method that really addresses them. The entire progression of practices that are within any presentation of the Mahamudra package are all designed to address aspects of this, to address the side that has, where there's something deep to be dissolved. The obscuration and the attachment to the kleshas, they're all kinds of things. Every aspect of the practice, in one sense, addresses that at some level. All the practices at some level also address the accumulation of what I like to refer to as underlying momentum and energy that leads towards enlightenment, that leads towards the fruition of the two bodhicittas. And it's helpful as much as we can to keep the larger frame of reference for our practice in mind as we go through it. Keeping in mind the profound potential of liberation as a vast scope. That liberation that is not only personal, but recognizes the total interdependence of all beings and phenomena, and as such naturally expresses itself in what we call the two bodhicittas, relative connections to others, ultimate recognition of the true nature. So keeping all this in mind, then for us to find places within that frame of reference for us to place our attention in the practice. And whether it's in just the cultivation of the skill of settling the mind, or the skill of bringing that settled awareness to the point where it can actually investigate all the experiences that arise and even investigate its own nature, all those practices, all the practices of relative bodhicitta, the four immeasurables, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, all of these, to be able to put our attention along the way on whatever it is what we're doing in the context of this larger, spacious aim. It's important. And the preliminary practices are designed in order to be able to facilitate this. Facilitate both bringing our attention to something particular in the practice, but also continually stretching our minds to hold the larger view, the larger context for practice. And along the way, there are a few general principles in practice, and one of them is that we actually have to do it. We have to apply ourselves. We have to, and so within the Ngondro practices, we have all these things about the number of recitations to do in order to count things up. Whether it's doing our prostrations or reciting the mantra for purification or offering the mandala of the universe, whatever it is, we have these structures for ensuring that we actually practice. We have the ritual form, and whether it's according to Dogo Kensei or according to what's laid out by Wanchuk Dorje in the Karma Kamsang, the ritual has a form to make sure that we kind of cover the bases, so to speak. All of these things have unintended consequences. And if I look at so much of what has been written and talked about Mudra over the last 10 or 15 years. There's a lot of talk and adjustments to programs. Well, instead of counting it this way, we'll do it by the amount of time. Instead of this, we'll do it slightly differently. We'll do this or that. And as I was thinking about, and the ritual includes all kinds of things that we can say, well, that doesn't exactly accord with my modern experience of the world, or this or that or the other thing. I have no idea what bodhisattvas are or what dharma protection. I don't know about this, I don't know. There are a lot of things that push us, and there are a lot of ways in which we can try to address those unintended consequences. But my thought in the last several weeks is that actually it's more important to keep your eye on the intended consequences. And if we can actually do that, then our relationship with some of these things that we find challenging can unfold in a different way, instead of approaching it from the side that, oh, that's a barrier to me getting to this thing. Let's go ahead and look around at this. And my offer to anyone who's actually inclined to follow up on it is that I will work with anyone about how to flip things around so that the unintended consequences don't get in the way, and so that it's possible to actually pay attention to the intended consequences. And I'm willing to be I'll just make that offer. But I'm willing to take responsibility in the context, particularly in the context of the Mahamudra program, because there's steps and levels, and you should do this in order to do that. I'm willing to take responsibility for how that proceeds, because I think we need both a certain amount of pressure to kind of contain our impulses to, well, I wish it was this way, or I wish it was that way, because those impulses have cumulatively added up to our exact position in samsara at this exact moment. So we do need some pressure to not go there. On the other hand, if certain things, particularly counting, there are certain kinds of things that people can become obsessed with in a way where the obsession is kind of bulletproof. I just can't get around my obsession about counting because I'm either good at it or bad at it. Take your pick, either way. But it becomes such a bulletproof obsession that something else has to happen. So I'm willing to take responsibility for working with that in the context of this program. For anybody who's in another program, I can't do that, but I can encourage you to find the pieces, find the ways of relating to these practices that are more helpful. So let's take a very brief silent break. And during that time, think of any questions that you might have. Just focused at this point, and if there are some, we'll address them briefly and then move on to some other things. So, just 5 minutes 8 minutes, something like that. Enough to move around. one thing I should mention about this book is that it's been published as a restricted volume. And that's not because all of it is, there are parts of it where it really would be applicable to anybody on the path. There are also parts of it that really should only be you shouldn't try to digest them and really work with them without the context of a container of practice and a certain amount of, so you could say, miles on the vehicle. This we actually have in the bookstore, but Booker Rinpoche, when he offered this to us, this is actually his condensed version to make it possible to actually, he wrote it mainly to make it possible to keep the outline of the overall path of practice in mind. And it's, it seems, it's that much in Tibetan, but that's a breeze for the Tibetans to memorize. It's really sad that we're as kind of weak in ability to retain things in memory as we are. But this, if somebody actually had memorized this, it was possible at any point to say, oh, that fits in this corner of the practice. This is now, and that's where it fits. It assumes this context and it provides a basis for what's to follow. But even with this, he said, just read up to the point in the practice that you're actually doing. So you could say, even though the magnetic attraction to start here and work backwards, like from the really, really cool stuff in the back, to work backwards from that, that's very strong. But that was the recommendation, and there's some reason for it. I think anybody who's practiced for a while can recognize that it's easy to have unhelpful projections about things as either being so easy because you thought it was easy to understand, but it's actually not that easy to do, or to think it's so hard that nobody could ever do it, even though when you actually get there, it actually turns out to be not like that. So there are reasons to kind of settle with the practice that you're doing. So, but that aside, that's about those books. There are several other books. One, I think it's also on the same, and I think it was has a commentary by Baro Kensi. It's been available since the early 80s anyway. Something like Eliminating the Darkness of Ignorance. There's a newer version that switches two of the words in the title. For why, I don't know. But there are other manuals that have the progression of practices of the path. So that aside, were there any questions that you had? Any things that you want to bring up at a general level? Yes, Bruce.
It's more of an affirmation, which is that I welcome the offer to discuss the practice, because in a nutshell, like I was raised in a household with Krishnamurti, and he was very adamant about the importance of like not coercing the mind, not coercing the person or the biological being, if whichever one. And I guess my concern, like most days, I can practice meditation very easily without having to push myself at all. But I guess in my exposure to like all these practices that are in that book, I'm a little bit concerned for myself about getting into a state where there's subtle self-coercion. But, a good example say, I feel like I should do this.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if this is the right venue for that discussion, but I will be taking you up on your offer to talk about these practices in that
Okay.
context.
It's there. There are some subtle things, and when Bokar Rinpoche was very, very aware that the program that he created was a work in progress, and it evolved over time and continued to do so. So I feel encouraged to continue that, investigating how things work, and to look carefully. And one example of that he discovered early on was that when he said, well, I'm so glad you all came to India, and here's the program, and the way it will work out is everybody will do 10,000 prostrations the first quarter, and 10,000 of the Vajrasattva and Mandala, and like that. And that's what the commitment is. And then when he found out that some people did not come back after, because they'd only gotten to like 9,999, just to put a more extreme point on it, he burst into tears. Because that was not the intention of expressing something in terms of a commitment. So there's something to explore there, and that's that balance between some kind of compassionate pressure and and finding our way to find the committedness in ourselves. It's really the committedness within ourselves that will be the thing that draws us. And to this, there is a dance of kind of internal and external pressures and whatnot, but it's a delicate thing. And I wouldn't want to make Bokar Rinpoche cry, even in whatever incarnation he's in now. So, for either reason, either for becoming so lax that we lost track of what the path was, or by turning it into something that it was not intended to be, which is as you say, just coercion. Looking at the Mundo practices as a whole, I frequently talk, when I talk about them, is that I sort of rant about how they're called the preliminary practices, and give some grudging acceptance to the word foundation practices. And I think both of those words have some downsides in terms of placing them almost as though they're obstacles on the way to the good stuff. Sort of, if there was some way you could kind of get through this somehow, you'd get on to the good stuff, the real stuff. The foundation is just this kind of ugly bunch of concrete that the house sits on. The house is the cool thing. The warm-ups and stretching are just sort of something that happens before you start the real game. And I think it's much better to consider the Mundo practices as something that is a way to develop core strength in spiritual practice. It's really, this is like, the simplest metaphors actually go into kind of a sports mode in terms of, but you could think of writing or whatever, that there are certain kinds of things in writing. You need to figure out something about grammar. You need to figure out how syntax of things works, how things work together, before you can say anything coherent. And before you can play any kind of game, you have to have some familiarity with the different dimensions of activity that are required. But it's not like the need to be coherent long term. The need to be coherent and be able to consider the structure of things doesn't disappear even after you've become good at grammar. And the need to be careful about your backhand or your serve doesn't go away just because you sort of learned how to. That's generally part of the game. And in the same way, the things that are brought to the surface in each of the Ngondro practices are similar, like that. And to go back to the question that I posed, like why doesn't the mind just sort of say, just, all right, let's everybody be quiet for a second and let the mind turn back into itself and settle and recognize its own pure nature, okay? If you literally run that test yourself, you immediately start running into things. It's instantaneous, and the longer you run the experiment and the more you try to do that, the more clear it is the range of things that get in the way. That's even just from our ordinary perspective. And the Ngondro practices as a whole address a lot of the stuff that gets in the way. They're designed to directly do that. The refuge from this perspective, the refuge and the bodhicitta, the refuge and bodhicitta with the prostrations, addresses our need to actually shift, to let go of the direction that or what we're magnetized to in life in general that does not turn out to be actually helpful. So there's something about just when we sit down, when we take refuge, that's part of what we're doing when we take refuge at the outside of the path. Saying, okay, my priority, there's sort of where my compass points is, I have a sense of direction and appreciation for the qualities of enlightenment. I have a sense of appreciation for what the Dharma can offer. I have a sense of appreciation for the support that the Sangha can offer. I recognize those things, so I see those. Those are in the center of my attention. They're the center of my. That's what I look at those examples, and that's what I'm oriented to. I let go of the word renunciation comes up quite a bit. It sounds a little moralistic and heavy-handed from our laissez-faire Western outlook. But the renunciation is actually recognizing that the things that we rely on that are problematic are actually problematic. So we give it up, let it go. So in the refuge there is that piece, and so we do refuge over and over again to reaffirm that outlook. That's part of the Ngondro practice. And I'll go into that, and I'll go into the refuge piece more in a little bit. But just setting a direction, then it's actually easy to find that, well, we actually have a huge amount of loyalty still embedded to all the patterns that we have. That loyalty is, when I heard Ken MacLeod use that word, loyalty to the kleshas, I thought, ding, that's it, that's it. We don't think of it in those terms, but we actually treat our pride and our particular style of irritation and aggravation with other people as our friends. We're kind of loyal buddies with this, you know. Yeah, there's so-and-so. Yeah, like, oh, I learned that now. I learned this method of expressing myself. I saw people in Italy do this. That's like, oh, good. So I'm just become wed to my style of my kleshas. So there's a certain amount of loyalty involved. Yes?
What's the term that you're using?
Klesha. K-L-E-S-H-A. It, sometimes translated as conflicting emotions. I use the term in the Sanskrit because actually I think it's better to try to treat it as a little bit of a blank slate and then add more and more understanding to it than say, oh, conflicting emotions, yeah, I got it. Because it's close, but it doesn't quite get the cigar. So in the Vajrasattva practice, there is that piece of continually letting go, being able to identify the patterns. Some of it's conscious with the 4 powers, there are particular contemplations that go along with it, identifying things to let go. But there's also something, and I think the Vajrasattva practice is a good place to point it out. It's something that's common throughout all the Ngondro practices. When we usually think about letting go of our habit patterns, it's kind of, I'm over here and I've identified this one thing, this one little possession of mine that I actually think maybe I ought to ditch it, maybe even pretend I never had it. I have this one thing. I'll set it down over there. Okay. The Vajrasattva practice, when we do that practice, and it involves experiencing a enlightened being above our head and being filled with the nectar, we're entirely filled with this palpable energy of purity, and everything disappears, including our sense of me as a one who has all kinds of crappy things that I hang on to, that I'm getting rid of one at a time. So it shifts a frame of reference. It expands our sense of what the practice is about. Instead of actually thinking of my ordinary self with kind of making some incremental improvements and adjustments to kind of get by somehow, which is our ordinary strategy in life, and it's pretty good if that's as good as we get. It's pretty good to kind of at least don't be the nail that sticks up and has a lot worse kleshas than everybody else. Kind of at least that much. That's actually pretty good. But this actually shifts the frame of reference to a frame of reference that actually absolute purity is not only possible, that's actually the frame of reference for the practice. And the purity is a bit of a loaded word, so just kind of hold it loosely. But that kind of shift, all of the Ngondro practices embody something about a shift to a much bigger perspective than just an incremental improvement. And to throw in a term that some are familiar with and some are not, there are two ways that views of practice and approaches to practices are divided. Just amongst all the other ones, it's just another filter. There's what's called the causal vehicle and the result vehicle. And the causal vehicle is the one that's approachable from the perspective of, I will do things incrementally to improve my situation. It's it's very useful because it's so accessible. That's the practice where actually identifying that one pattern, like I should stop mentally doing that to people and being proud of that. I should give that one thing up. That's the causal vehicle. The result vehicle actually requires us to flip over to the other side and say, the potential is complete purity. That's the intrinsic potential. I need to relate from that side too. So we work from both sides, but the Ngondro practices allow us to actually to work on both sides. It's kind of working both sides of the fence a little bit. And the Vajrasattva practice is actually a good example of that. Both identifying particular patterns to give up, developing some sense of regret, taking refuge, all those things too. Kind of you take an alternative approach. But there's also the piece of, by the end of the practice, we're entirely filled, and our mind, by virtue of the capacity to attend to whatever's arising at that point, what's arising based on the imagination of the practice, is that we are entirely purified. Our being is nothing but this expression of purity. You could say more about it, but just leave it there. And in each of the practices, the root Lama or the Buddha actually dissolves and merges into us. So whatever we thought was somewhere else, something better than us, something else other, it's not elsewhere, it's right here. So there's a big kind of shift in view that all of the Ngondro practices involve. The mandala offering is also a big shift in view. We tend to think of generosity again as like, here I am in this world with nothing but, I can figure out how to spare the lid to my teacup. I'm kind of attached to my teacup, but I could get by without the lid. Would you like it? So from that frame of reference, then our generosity is kind of, so it's incremental, and again, if all we could imagine that our sense of kind of internal resourcefulness, if all we could imagine is offering the semi-useful thing, this one thing, if that's all we could imagine offering, that's very good. That's very good. We should do that. We should cultivate generosity from that side. But the mandala practice, you could say it inverts the whole thing. It's like, okay, well, the cup, the lid and the cup, the lid and the cup and the tea, the lid, the cup, the tea, and the table. All that is something that that's kind of small potatoes in this, but still, if I actually had control of the universe, just to go out to the extreme, I think I'd be cool there. I don't think I would need Dharma practice. If everything that I know of was actually under my control, I wouldn't need Dharma practice. I'd have it, if only. And that sense of if only even goes to the point of, I want to understand this universe. I want to kind of contain this notion of the universe within my ideas. So I have this idea of a universe. From the point of view of the mandala practice, it's all offered. It's all given away. So even this sense of fixation as, and they use the term, the universal monarch. The universal monarch, one who could have anything, could control anything, whose possessions allow for any kind of control, even being that. That's just part of what you offer. You offer the whole thing. Enlightenment is bigger than the universe. It's not something that sort of occurs within this, my life, me and my friend's life, kind of here in our little Sangha, or doesn't even occur within the container of what we think of as the universe. Again, this is a big shift. And in the Guru Yoga, one of the dimensions of that is that we start to see ourselves not in terms of our ordinary experience of ourselves, but to start to see ourselves as in terms of the result vehicle perspective. So we begin that practice by actually seeing ourselves as a Buddha, you could say. I'm not going to go into the details, but that's the shortcut. And then through devotion, through recognizing the qualities of enlightenment, then in the Guru Yoga, that's actually, we're no different. We're no different than the Buddha. So all these things we can see if we look in our ordinary calm abiding practice. We don't tend to think of ourselves as having this profound potential. Very often we will see ourselves as, I'm the one who actually can't hardly pay attention at all. So what hope do I have for the rest of it? And on down through. So my perspective on the Ngondro practices is that these aren't the only, you could say, this is not the exhaustive list of the intended consequences of doing the practice, but this is an example of how these practices can stretch us. So that was a fairly long ramble from my part. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you now. What questions you have, what observations? Bruce?
Succinct commentary on the Mandela practice?
There are several. Yeah. That one is the one where most people, they could be sort of enthused by what I've said so far and said, oh yeah, okay, I think I could relate to that maybe. Then they get to the mandala practice and says, okay, take this little metal plate and a big pile of rice, and now imagine this universe that is completely alien to our ordinary notion of the structure of the universe, and you create all this, and you imagine all these things that are the possessions of the universal monarch who we don't believe in, who can do all these kinds of things. And now you busily offer this over and over again. And for most people, that's just like, what? It's hard to wrap your head around. But providing this is a case where the structure of the ritual provides actually a basis for doing something, but then you start to look at the unintended consequences of the structure of the ritual can easily get in a way of actually finding something juicy in that. And one of my most favorite examples in that is they're great things like the field that grows and harvests itself without any toil. It's great. How many people don't want a job where they actually don't really have to work hard? So, or at least not any of the unpleasant part of it. Like, okay, good. But my favorite one is the wish-granting cow, which is so absurdly outside of the frame of reference. So, like, we don't even have cows anymore. Anybody have cow? No. Okay. So we don't even have cows. And then the wish-granting cow, of course, whatever you want. Whatever you want. The wish-granting cow, by the way, is very beautiful. Color of the sunrise, hoofs of sapphire, horns of diamond, amazing patterns, like henna patterns painted on. Absolutely beautiful. I would, even if she was off and not offering wishes that day, I would go see her. Just no question. But the notion that it's very exotic, but we actually already own the wish-granting cow in terms of our if-only mind. Our if-only mind wants to have all the things granted. So if I just had the wish-granting cow, if I just had the this, if I just had the that, I'd be okay. So I think it's possible, even within the form of some of these practices, to find things that actually transcend our sense of, oh, that's really alien. It's really alien, but actually it's got my number. It understands me quite well. Tracy, then Peter.
So I guess just opening, like why have I come?
Mm-hmm.
And then leading to a question. If I haven't entirely, I feel like I've drunk the Kool-Aid of wanting to do these practices. I'm kind of like a husky. I'm like in the harness, and I'm like, let's go. And so I very enthusiastic. Have a lot of joy still from going to the seminar in Bodh Gaya, and already running into all kinds of obstacles, but I can like suspend my problem with them, just riding on the enthusiasm, and just trusting this is going somewhere. I know where I was going before, and I didn't like where I was going, so I really want to try this. So, and like astonished in reading this little in this little book, how it just says this is like a practice for your lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, thinking about that too. Even though I'm already older, so have maybe less life. But in coming back to the States, I realize how much of just going to the seminar, being in Bodh Gaya, just is this strong current of spiritual practice carrying me there, where I just could just pop in the current and be carried with it, right? It's not that there was no effort. Absolutely there was effort, but lots of support for that effort. And then coming back, I'm profoundly grateful that here's this practice that Bokar Rinpoche created for Westerners who are working and spending most of our days working. And it's just really interesting to try and transplant my working life into the soil of the practice. And one of the things that's coming up for me now is I'm just absolutely as much as possible doing the refuge tree prostration practice, and I'm doing the morning shanta and other things. But in the evening when I come home after 10 hours of work, I sometimes the bargain is just
today, and I'm saying the mantra, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm really standing up. And so my question is, so my intention is, I'm trying to graft my life into this practice. So is it okay to do it that way, noticing that I am practicing a trance state with my prostration practice?
Mm-hmm.
Or do I need to say, whoa, let's put the trance aside, let's do maybe do fewer prostrations, but because I'm trying to do a whole mandala every night.
Mala.
A mala.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe just do 10 and do them really well. So that's
You can try the experiment. See if the trance state just lasts for a shorter time. I'm being a little facetious there. It's very easy in any practice to slip like that, for the energy to slip. And the more elements to the practice there are, the easier it is to once the elements become kind of sort of stable memory, then it's easier to slip. In that case, I think it's actually it's important to have kind of one hook in the middle of it. You have there is the dimension with the and I think I'll actually address this in more detail when I'll just go through the practice and then point out some things. But it's important to have like one hook, something you really can put your mind on in the midst of all the things that are going on.
As in, like, thinking about Vajradhara?
Yeah, well, that's actually, I brought something, some hooks out of, one part of it's out of Ringo Tulku's book on the Lundo, and another one's from another book where some suggested things to, you place your mind on this. And I'll just read the first one. So it says, this is from the Drigun Kagyu tradition. But may the meaning of impermanence be generated in my mind. I don't necessarily like the phrasing, but just, you could pick anything. Please bestow blessings on me that I may generate in my mind the meditative stabilization on the stages of generation and completion. Or blessings that whatever relationships I may enter into have meaning, have profound meaning. So that one I think is actually really accessible. You would have to find the ones that are kind of like pop, but that one goes, whoo, here I am, I'm doing the prostrations, holding in my attention, my connections to all beings. So there are many things, and I'll talk a little bit more about it as we go through, but there are many things that you could see within the landscape of the practice the practice environment that we brought into our imagination. But there we are with all sentient beings, and we're saying, like all, past, present, and future. So then, to be able to hold that one thought, may I become skilled in the methods of, may whatever relationships I enter into have meaning. May all my relationships have meaning. So then that provides like, oh yes, I'm remembering my parents, I'm remembering my friends, I'm remembering so-and-so, I'm remembering these people that I just kind of saw while I got on or off the bus. I'm remembering the guy that was passed out asleep behind me on the streetcar the other day. Then that becomes like, then that actually gives us something to really focus on. So I would suggest something like that. And because I know that as soon as I pass something out, the reading starts. That's what I do anyway. I'll hand them out later, but it is a way to actually poke into dimensions of the practice when it's kind of gotten kind of glazed over. We glaze over in our practice the same way we glaze over in ordinary life. I think, oh yeah, here I am at the Dharma Center. That's right. I just said to myself, I have to go on Sunday morning. Here I am. Oh yeah, I gotta sit down. All right, it's like glaze. I've been here before. I know what's going on. It's kind of glazed. We glaze over all the time. So finding out that we glaze over in our practice should not be some kind of real shock. But within that, then we have to find ways to wake up within that. You can make two kind of fundamentalist statements about this. And I think they're both worth, and they're exactly the opposite, which I think is great. One is that if you're wandering like that, your practice will have absolutely no impact. The other is that if you even say the name of a Buddha once, it's never without profound impact. And so I think we have to learn, okay, like which side of me am I trying to fool at the moment? Am I trying to fool myself by saying it's actually okay, it doesn't matter? Well, then I better say, well, practicing in a trance will have no effect. But on the other hand, if we're getting really down on ourselves, and we say, oh man, I think my whole last week was a trance, but I still kept going with this form of the practice somehow through that. That still has an impact. It still has kind of an impact. And there are ways in which even that, the fact that we kept going for a week and we were in a trance and we woke up a week later, something actually happened in that week. Something happened, and then we have the opportunity to wake up. The really sad thing was if to say, well, I'm just practicing in a trance, so I think I'm just going to give up practicing. Oops. You don't even have the mysterious subliminal momentum going on for you then. That's an example of like kind of. Then you work with the one that actually provides most strength and inspiration. Kind of the one where you can say, whatever this little weak thread, I'm going to honor the fact that it's still a thread. I'm not going to just grab it and yank like that right in the moment to get back into the deep things. But if I follow this thread carefully, I pull it back carefully, really carefully, then it's a little stronger. Cynthia. Oh, Peter, you had a question. I went on for long, didn't I?
I'm going to go for three questions, but the first one's a goof one, which is like when you were talking about maybe talking to you about ways of working with the practice. I thought I should ask Bill if I can visualize myself 111,111 times. Can I just do one prostration and call it good? That's a joke.
The serious answer would be yes.
If you could.
Yeah. They actually say all it takes is one real prostration. So you wouldn't even need the extra 111,000. Just so that, okay. So there we go.
The more serious questions are if the four
Mm.
the Vajrasattva practice, because it's just repeating a 100-syllable mantra, you know, you can do that faster than the
Mhm.
prostrations.
There's some variation. There's some variation. Depends on how old you are. If you're in your 20s and you've been working out a lot, you might be able to fly through prostrations. Dora at one point could do 600 in an hour.
So, now, here's a, I'm
I
kind
tried
of
the other day and I did 2 sets of 25 separated by half a day. I thought, ooh,
so
I'm glad I didn't push it any harder than that.
I'm a very literal person, so when I read directions that say, you know, I think I've broken it out where I don't say all, you know, refuge to all 6 at once. I do, you know, one at a time
Mm.
kind of thing. And I had thought I could do 1,000 a day. Then I was like, wow, it's taking me 4 hours to do, you know, 300 plus.
Mm.
And now I'm like, wow, if I can do 108 a day, that's what I'm going to try to do, but that's going to take me like 3 years. And so, and I'm okay with that because actually I like the practice. And
I think Nwandra took me 19 years.
okay, I was thinking 12. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I
Ooh,
was thinking.
you're on the fast track.
Maybe. I'm not just starting, so that's the projection. Yeah,
Yeah.
talk to me after 12.
Yeah. And then after 12 years, I say, oh, it seemed to work so nicely for you. Do it again.
I think you could like some of the practices that you would want to do.
Yeah. Well, they become they actually literally become parts of other practices. There are lots of practices where, I mean, all practices begin with refuge, so that's a reusable component. Many of the Vajrayana practices will include the recitation of the purification mantra, once or even twice in the practice. Many will include a mandala offering, maybe even quite a few mandala offerings. All Vajrayana practice is, in some sense, Guru Yoga. So it's, if you're sort of going in that direction, it's there all the time, anyway.
And I was reading Kali Rinpoche, Luminous Mind book, and it seemed to kind of go from Nundro practice to deity yoga before it gets onto Mahamudra.
Mm-hmm.
And is there, like, is the Vajrasattva practice like deity yoga? I mean, or the guru yoga of the 4 foundational practices? Are any of those equivalent to deity yoga?
Equivalent, no, but components in certain aspects, you say, oh well, that is like this part of a yidam practice. Oh, that's like this part of a yidam practice. But it's not. None of them are exactly a yidam practice.
And is the Chen Rizzi practice that's done on Wednesdays, is that a deity yoga?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let's see, Cynthia.
So 2 aspects of shamatha. You've described foundational or preliminary as strengthening our core,
Mm-hmm.
and I think of shamatha as one of the core strengths. And part of my stepping back from Nundro was I wanted to get a little more stable in my place in my mind
Mm-hmm.
and work on that core strength and then apply it in the Nundro.
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect of shamatha is telling, once with an interview with Kempo Koga, telling him about this weight that was like just sitting on me. And he listened, and then he said, in my Nundro, incorporate more shamatha, just without the text, but just
Mm-hmm.
incorporate more just sitting
Mm-hmm.
in my practice. And I kind of wonder in the Nundro practice how to, I can let go
with a worry of, will I finish Nirvana in this lifetime? Because
Yeah.
I've incorporated so much shamatha, I'm not getting my counting done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but do I just feel my way through about, okay, just sit, pause, just sit?
Mm-hmm.
Do I just try and feel my way through it, and some days might be mostly sitting, some sessions? Even though it's short times, like Lama Michael's been teaching.
Oh, yeah. That's very good. This is actually something that Kepler Donya Rinpoche mentioned in the seminar this year, was that to sometimes just stop. Just stop in the middle. And I was just looking at my notes again. There was one piece where he was talking about, particularly when we're doing prostrations, we're exerting a lot of effort, really. And then there's sometimes in the midst of that, having a kind of just the way we might say, I want to go kind of burn off some energy. I'm going to go for a run, and kind of, and then after that, we're kind of. He said that in that situation, sometimes it's possible to let go in a more profound way. So just sit. So I think that's something that I think is being recommended or brought to the fore with more regularity than what I recall from the past. In our early instructions in Ngondro with Kala Rinpoche and with Lama Tinley and others, it was really presented like this is the recipe. Don't pause to throw in taste the soup, or don't do this. You just keep stirring. Just throw the mantra in, stir continuously until 100 are done, and then stir them 100 times. Then take the spoon out. Then do this other thing. But that possibility of just pausing, kind of just pausing in the middle, is really important, I think. The one suggestion that I would offer there is to have brought yourself to not pause in the middle of kind of having you run yourself down into a kind of a raggedness, or off into the trance, or whatever the kind of the distracted or state, but to come and bring some energy and clarity back in a kind of in a gentle way, and then to take a moment and just can be very good.
I remember while doing prostrations, the room would fill up with everybody. and then the idea of just pausing while everybody was there.
Did they all look at their watch and wonder when you're going to get back to it? Oh, good. You have very patient friends. Yeah, pausing, just completely letting go.
Lama Michael will talk about, or you and Zopa repeat the instruction where during a break, make sure it's not at a point of distraction, but when we place the mind.
Mm-hmm.
My sculpture teacher used to say, you don't stop work when you're stuck. You stop work when you know what you're going to do next. There seems to be a similar, I'm not stopping when I'm lost or exhausted.
Yeah, Svanch and Linda.
Okay.
So just a couple more.
Yeah, Bill, you know, you meant this is a program, right? At the stage at which we are, don't grow, is kind of generic, right? Everybody does the same thing. And you also mentioned it's a practice of a lifetime, which that resonates with me. I can see how this is needed for me. Um, but when I pay attention and when I read um, the life of Milarepa, 100,000 songs, or when I read Matthew Ricard's write-up of Shapkar,
Mm.
in which there are several stories about the relationship between a student and a teacher, right? And the kind of guidance that is being given, okay? And I pay particular attention sometimes to what's the guidance that this enlightened master is giving to his disciple who is down the line going to become enlightened, right? Like, Gampopa, right? Gampopa and Milarepa. You find what I found is in the stories is that Gampopa goes back to his teacher, right? And his teacher says, "Well, I gave you this practice to do. Tell me what happened."
Mm-hmm.
And then, based on what happened, Milarepa then gives him some other guidance, okay, or another practice to do, okay. And so it plays out like that over an entire season, right? Like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
several months. So where I'm going with this is, at what stage does within our program do things actually get more finessed for the individual? And another way to say this is, okay, we have these practices, they're all important for us, we need to do them. But at what stage also is there the recognition that, for you actually need this deity yoga versus that deity practice?
Right. Okay. The simple answer is that Marpa knew before Milarepa even showed up that Milarepa was showing up, and that a particular method of purification was needed. So, if we have the opportunity to find Marpa or Milarepa or Gampopa, and this is important, we happen to recognize them, then the process that you're describing can play out. On a level for lesser beings, it's following the prescription is more reliable. And then within that, there's some nuance, depending on the relationship. But that's something that develops over time. It takes quite a while to develop the kind of relationship where both the student and the mentor have some sense of the mutual capacities and some sense of trust in the dynamic. That takes some time. So it's not a stage. It's not a stage exactly. But I think it's very worthwhile investing time to see where things go in terms of developing relationships. and it's important not to have any kind of expectations or hold up a yardstick to say in our minds, well, when Gampopa got to a certain point, then he went to Milarepa, and then this certain thing happened, and it worked out a certain way. The way that worked was different than what happened between Milarepa and Marpa, and that was different than what happened between Marpa and Naropa, and so on. That dynamic where that the capacity, the remarkable capacity of the student and the remarkable capacity of the teacher came together in a unique way. And that continues to happen in a unique way. And so even with ordinary mortals, it still happens in a unique way. But I think there would be more reliance on the prescription, on the form. There's more reliance on the fact that Boka Rinpoche had some kind of idea what to put in motion. So it happens, I think it happens differently. But for it to happen, it actually requires time. It requires time and a kind of spiritual intimacy where the word honesty comes to mind, but it's not our ordinary sense of honesty as opposed to dishonesty. It's more a sense of honesty as opposed in the sense of being very being able to really discern in our own mind stream what's going on, and to discern how to articulate that in a way that might foster a discerning reply. So it's a delicate and very unique situation, I think, and it takes time. But I wish everybody luck in finding the Gampopa or the Milarepa of the current era, and we should actually, this is the kind of thing that we can say, well, I wish you luck in this. We should actually sort of make this kind of a hardcore, deep wish that each and every being actually find that. So it takes it out of and if we can do that for others, it may also resonate in a way that's beneficial for ourselves. The two benefits always come together. And if we can actually make it that wish for others beyond our personal sense of I want, then maybe it comes about.
You know, reading those exchanges between the practice that is being prescribed by the teacher and the student were very inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Have you read the exchanges between Milarepa and Rechungpa?
Yes, Rechungpa is the first section is of write-up, and then Gampopa comes later. But I don't remember everything about Rechungpa. I think that part of it I skipped and I went to the Gampopa section.
Rechungpa knows what to do himself. And it's not that he turned out entirely bad, but not everything worked out. It's instructive. Yes, briefly.
Briefly, very briefly. What just was stimulated by Subanja's, just thinking of karma, and I think of my birth circumstances, and how fortunate I am to have found these teachings. And that inspires me a lot.
Yeah.
And I think about when I started meditating in the late 70s and how I evaluate my meditation practice. I think, gee, it's been a long time and I'm not quite sure it's turned out as what I think it should be like if I had done something like that for that many years. So it just was an interesting contemplation to think about Nundro and shamatha.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it being turned around, like in the West, we usually learn shamatha first and then we go to Nundro.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing is just, I don't think this is betraying any confidence. I just remember Eric Fromme telling me when Khenpo Lodro Dani Rinpoche came to Seebeck and he had just finished the last of his Nundro and he was pretty happy. And he told Rinpoche and Rinpoche said, it's wonderful, start again. So
It happens.
I like to think of that when I think, one, how long it's taking me and whether I will ever finish.
Mm-hmm.
That is my aspiration. And then if I did, well, then start again. So
Yeah.
these are the things.
It is worth actually thinking. To think about the Lundro practice and think about shamatha practice both, as though, well, let's flip our ordinary approach to the order of what you're introduced to. Not necessarily that we should do that, because I think there are very good reasons to do it, introducing shamatha first. But if we thought of shamatha as something that actually required this profound preparation to create the fertile ground for it, then it would look like a different practice. It would look and feel very different. And I think that's actually part of the intention of the Lundro practices, is to make all practice look very different. To look and have it open up kind of in a different, it's a well-fertilized garden that it's growing in. There's something very different about what's possible when we see it that way. Well, I do want to go through the practice one time in a kind of brief way with a few comments along.
Are these for purchase?
Yeah, mm-hmm. You can if you want. We had some loaners out. I think you just picked these up out of the bookstore. Looks like there were some in the back that say Shrine Copy or something like that on there. Oh, well. We'll just pray gently over them. Don't pray so hard that the pages curl. So starting on page 1, and interesting. And for those who have the cliff notes, as you say, there are as with all practices of this style, there are more details than are included in the recitation. So I know Peter, I think everybody has one that wants one, or if anybody wants one, but you can have it. But I'll be going through it, so you don't need to read it going through. I might want to look at it just for fun. But the first section, the way that this was initially set up by Bokar Rinpoche was to do one of the Ngondro practices in each quarter of the year, a certain amount of it. And it started out with 10,000, and that looked like that was too short a runway, too much practice and too short a runway for people to launch who weren't familiar with it. Then he went to 5,000. Then he said, well, maybe at the beginning of the if you're just starting out, it's okay if you just do the calm abiding practices and the mind training pieces and the contemplations. Just do those and then add on. But he provided this outline of how to do the practice, which is it's a ritual container that allows certain things to, it's a garden of a certain size and dimension, and we plant certain things in it. And it starts out with as many, again, on the theme of these practices show up elsewhere. The recitation on page 1 will show up at the very beginning of many practices, many Vajrayana practices. We'll have this brief prayer. At the bottom of the page it says prayer to the Root Lama. You could also, His Holiness Karmapa has referred to this as a time to take kind of a self-empowerment. So you could take an empowerment from your root teacher at the beginning of the practice. So we'll read this page, and this involves either in space in front or in the space above our head, imagining the Root Lama in the form of Dorje Chung. You could, for just a quick interpretation, you could just say the Buddha. So the Buddha is present, and it has mainly to do with there's no elaborate visualization, so it's just kind of an instantaneous thing. So even just an instantaneous sense of the presence of an enlightened being. Then we recite, glorious and precious Root Lama, who sits on a lotus moon seat on the crown of my head, having accepted me through your great kindness, please grant the realization of enlightened body, speech, and mind. So particularly when you're becoming familiar with a practice, or in cases where we start to notice that we're going into a trance, whatever, sometimes it's good to just stop. To begin with some kind of intention and vividness, then you recite something like this, and then you just stop. Bring it back to mind, just the sense of it. And then I won't go into how to contemplate the four thoughts right now, but these are profoundly transformative if we incorporate them into our outlook. And the only way to incorporate them into our outlook is to contemplate them deeply over time. And one of the few ways, but we need to actually implant in our mind stream what they are, a reminder of what they are. So a very brief recitation like this can be the basis for continually encouraging us to remember them, to plant them in our stream of being. So again, we may take time here and actively contemplate one or each or two or three as we go through, but to bring them, or it may just be that we're at a point where they have such impact that just recalling one of them, it just brings something back like that. But the precious human existence, impermanence, karma, and the faults of samsara are the topics. Okay, we recite together. Meditate first upon this free and endowed precious human existence, so difficult to obtain and so easily destroyed. From this moment on, make it meaningful. Second, everything is impermanent. Environments and their inhabitants. The life force of beings in particular is fragile as a bubble. The hour of death is uncertain, and when it arrives, we become nothing but corpses. Because the Dharma is the only help at that time, practice with diligence. You can think not only at the time of death, but any time we become completely lost. It's like the death of our intention and our aspiration to maintain mindfulness. Any time that goes, our karma takes hold. It's the impermanence. It's like the death. Third, at the time of death, there is no freedom due to our actions' karma. Therefore, abandon harmful deeds and devote the time always to virtuous action. Contemplate in this way, examine the mind stream daily. The mind stream could be also like stream of becoming. The closest we would have, I think in our ordinary vocabulary, would be personality. But watch, or you could say our personal, psychological, operational style. Keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on it, because that's where karma plays out. That's where our aspirations can take hold and become fruitful. Examine the mind stream daily. Fourth, among the places, friends, happiness, wealth, and so on in cyclic existence, there is torment from the three types of suffering. It is like the feast presented by the executioner as he leads one to the execution ground. Having cut the shackles of attachment, accomplish enlightenment with diligence. The first noble truth, the truth of suffering. It's important to look very, very deeply into this, so we see the operation of confusion and how it results in suffering, looking deeper and deeper. You could say that any of the four thoughts, if we look deeply enough, would be a pointing out instruction for Mahamudra, pointing out the true nature. This is in particular true of looking very, very deeply into how confusion arises. Seeing it right at its root. Be self-liberated. We turn to refuge in bodhicitta. And here we imagine ourselves, as it says in the description, it will say some of the description, the particulars, but we imagine ourselves in an environment where two things are there that we don't usually see in our ordinary life. One is we do not usually see ourselves in the presence of awakened, enlightened mind. Even though that's our own true nature, we don't see it. We don't recognize the influence it could have in our life. The other thing is that this environment that we imagine recognizes that we actually, in fact, always are connected with all other beings. We imagine all beings of the past, present, and future there with us, and this is something that between seeing ourselves in the presence of the awakened beings and feeling ourselves in the presence of all others, feeling that connection, just shifting our attention like that, if we contemplate it deeply, we can understand that this is actually a more accurate picture of how it is. In our ordinary lives, we imagine ourselves not in the presence of awakened ones, not connected to that possibility. And we imagine ourselves only connected to those that we could say loom large in our life. So this is a very important piece of this practice, is just to step into that environment. So together, in front of oneself, in the center of a lake, is the wish-fulfilling tree with a single trunk and 5 main branches. At the center, where the branches converged, is a lion throne with a lotus, sun, and moon seat. Upon it is our root lama, Vajradhara, surrounded by the Kagyu lamas. In front of the lama are the yidams, to the right are the Buddhas, behind are the sacred Dharma text, to the left the Sangha, below the throne are the guardian protectors of the Dharma. Each is surrounded by a vast retinue of their own kind. Upon the grassy shore of the lake are gathered all our mothers of old, pervasive as space. With single purpose and resolve, we go for refuge and rouse the mind of awakening. O kind root Lama, together with the lineage, you are the essential nature and synthesis of the body, speech, mind, qualities, and enlightened activities of all the Tathagatas of the 3 times and 10 directions, the source of the 84,000 collections of Dharma, and Lord of the noble Sangha, myself and all sentient beings equaling the limits of the sky. And then the main recitation, again to refresh a sense of the presence of the enlightened ones in space immediately in front of us, the presence of all sentient beings surrounding us, those near and dear right close to us, all those with whom we have a difficult relationship in front, where they will get the most direct exposure, have the most access. So imagining that we, as leaders of all sentient beings, it's like we were the first ones to notice at this particular instant that the enlightened ones were immediately present. And so as we recite, all beings notice and recite. And as we do prostrations, it's as though our energy actually lifts all sentient beings. We go for refuge to the glorious holy lamas. We go for refuge to the yidams, the deities of the mandala. We go for refuge to the Buddhas, the transcendent conquerors. We go for refuge to the sacred Dharma. We go for refuge to the noble Sangha. We go for refuge to the assembly of Dakas, Dakinis, Dharma protectors, and guardians who possess the eyes of intrinsic awareness. And if we had more time, we would recite more, and we could even, if we had even more time, we could do a few prostrations together. For those who have some physical challenge, I still encourage doing some kind of physical action to associate with this, whether it's just touching the forehead, throat, and heart, and bowing slightly, or maybe standing in front of a chair and bowing a little bit more, touching our head to the back of the chair, whatever it is, to actually engage the full dimension of our being in the practice. So after we've done the recitation and offered the prostrations, holding all sentient beings again, the vast panorama in our minds, then we do the Bodhisattva vow. And for that, you can kneel with the right knee down in the attitude of taking the vow. If you've stood and you're doing prostrations, then it's easy after that to just adopt that posture. So we'll recite this once. Until the heart of enlightenment is reached, I go for refuge to the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the assembly of Bodhisattvas. Just as the former Sugatas roused the spirit of awakening and persevered in the stages of the Bodhisattva's training, I also, for the benefit of beings, give rise to the awakening mind and will similarly train in the successive stages. And then there's a series of prayers of aspiration and celebration. Now my life is fruitful. I have obtained an excellent human existence. Today I am born into the family of awakened ones and have become a child of the Buddhas. From now on, in all possible ways, I will engage in actions which conform to this family, so that this faultless, noble lineage will not be defiled. And here, speaking of stepping into the family of the Buddhas, it says become a child of the Buddhas, and the term in the Tibetan actually refers to one who is fully mature and ready to take on whatever, to inherit fully the mantle of whatever is to be inherited. So it's not, child is a little bit diminutive. It's kind of a stronger statement. So we really take our place in the family of awakened ones here. There's kind of a heroic dimension to the Bodhisattva outlook. There's a huge amount of, or you could say both, you have to find this interesting play of the humility and the kind of the heroic outlook together. It's an interesting play. And continuing, today in the presence of all the refuges, I invite all beings as guests to share in happiness until we have reached the absolute joy of the Sugatas. Celestials and non-celestials alike rejoice. The spirit of awakening is precious. May it arise in whom it has not arisen. Once arisen, may it not diminish, but ever increase and flourish. As I strive in the conduct of a bodhisattva, inseparable from the awakening mind and thoroughly protected by the Buddhas, may negative actions be abandoned. May the bodhisattva's intention for the benefit of beings be fulfilled. Through the intentions of the protectors, may sentient beings attain happiness. May all beings possess happiness. May all the lower states of existence be emptied forever. May the prayers of all bodhisattvas abiding on the various stages be accomplished. And then taking a pause to make sure that we're still holding sense of the presence of all the awakened ones before us, surrounded by all sentient beings. We recite the four immeasurables. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be apart from the sacred happiness which is free of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, impartial attachment and aversion. So usually, along with the refuge recited multiple times, the Bodhisattva vow recited 3 times. This would be recited 3 times or more. It's also good to just sit and contemplate it. But again, now come the conclusion of the session. All the awakened ones dissolve into light and are absorbed into the main form, the Guru in the center. Radiant, intensely vibrant, active, expressing profound love and kindness and compassion. This light dissolves into us through the crown of our head. The essence of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Simply rest in the midst of this. And then dedication, which can be found by flipping all the way to the back and then flipping back. Got 2 pages where it says dedication prayers. And here holding just the sense of the presence of the enlightened ones and the sense of our connection to all sentient beings. We dedicate. I dedicate this virtue that all beings without exception reach the undying state of Vajra mind through the ever blissful union of means and wisdom. Traveling the inner Vajra path, may they attain the pinnacle of awakening. By this virtue, may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. Through the blessing of the Buddhas who attained the 3 kayas, through the blessing of the unchanging truth of Dharmata, through the blessing of the unwavering intention of the Sangha, may this dedication and aspiration be fulfilled. So I mentioned that I found some suggestions of things that one might settle one's mind on while doing the prostrations. So we pass those out, but these are examples of how to find little sort of niches of meaning and inspiration. One thing that I would also offer as a comment is that I think it's possible while we're doing the prostrations, reciting the refuge prayer, while we're holding all sentient beings, we can actually reflect and just feel how the 4 immeasurables are actually embodied in that. It's just, it is, and if we hold all sentient beings in that way, and holding them, all of us sharing this connection with enlightenment, and that we're like sort of the leaders that have pointed out this possibility in the midst of all that's going on. There's a natural aspect of loving kindness, there's a natural aspect of compassion, natural aspect of sympathetic joy, and certainly equanimity is embodied throughout in terms of holding all beings. So there is a way that I think we could, it is again, to go back to the kind of the opposite of the trance, is to actually recognize in this practice that it does actually embody these things, and we can lean at one moment into one or another of them to feel that, and then allow that that resonance to go deeper into us, so it does become transformative. It's possible when we're doing this kind of practice that beings become kind of static. It's kind of like if we're on the high occupancy vehicle lane and we just put a couple of mannequins in the car with us, it's like, no, this is not right. And in the same way, when we hold all beings, it can be kind of static. So I think it's important to keep some kind of dynamism in that, and then it will, what we do in formal practice will resonate in our relationships in the world, and then vice versa. So we kind of, in our formal contemplations of the Four Immeasurables, will also inform that. So that's one piece. Another one of the most profound transformative contemplations is the contemplation of the Four Thoughts. And it's possible to actually actively kind of lean into that a little bit within this practice. If we think of all beings with us and we go beyond kind of the mannequin representation, we have to connect with all the dynamics of multiple lifetimes, that play, that profound play of karma, the profound play of the ups and downs, the suffering and joys, the impermanence of it all. And then within that, the preciousness of actually being able to turn the mind to the Dharma. So recognizing. So there's a way that we can actually see that within this practice as well. So these are ways to lean the practice towards a dimension where it's more transformative. It calls on those and reinforces the other practices that we do, other elements of contemplations, where that becomes make it more active. Just being in the presence, imagining that we're never actually cut off from our connection with enlightened ones is also very transformative. And to encourage that, Lama Tinley said, again, to kind of overcome the static piece of it, you can imagine that the radiance of the enlightened ones touches us the way that we might, on a cool day, we might step outside and the sun sort of touches us and permeates us in a sense of that warmth. We have a feeling of kind of the support, like the wind's at my back, the world is supportive, and to be able to feel a sense of connectedness and to be open in that way to the connection with the enlightened ones. Those are dimensions to foster this. So I think that's good enough for today. I've managed to run over by less than I usually run over. So I thank you for your patience. So let us again mentally dedicate holding the presence of all sentient beings and the enlightened ones. Thank you. And pass those around. The first set is more general contemplations. The second one from Ringo Tulku's book is something that actually goes more to the actual act of the prostration and what one could think of in terms of the enliven the actual physical gesture a little bit. So.
So if anybody wants to purchase a text or something from the bookstore, I'm happy to be in there and support that.
Does anybody want one of the what we so indelicately called the Cliff Notes?